right, so this week's snippets, some good questions on the World War II period and the immediate period following. So let's get to them. So first question is: FDR dies in office, Stalin dies in office, Churchill loses re-election. How do we see Churchill through the lens of a savior of Western democracy? How does he lose a democratic election? It's a good question. In some ways, it's counterintuitive. There were a couple of things that went on. So first of all, here's the map of the British parliamentary map from the 1945 election. The red is the Labour Party, which is sort of the left of center party. The blue is the Conservative Party, which is Churchill's party. We see up here in Scotland some Scottish parties. The yellow is the Liberal Party, which at one point was the dominant left-wing party, but had been in decline for 40 or 50 years. And you can see the shift here. Labour picks up 239 seats. Conservatives lose 189 seats. Labour wins the election by more than 11 points. So this is just a complete wipeout for Churchill. So arguably three things that are working in concert that explain this. The first is that although Churchill was the prime minister, was head of the Conservative Party during World War II, and he insists on this from the start when he comes to office. He wants a war cabinet, that is a cabinet that includes members of all parties. And so the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, is part of the cabinet. There are liberals in the cabinet as well. So this is an odd sort of case in which Attlee can run as the candidate in 1945 as someone who was an active participant in Churchill's wartime experience. So it's kind of hard for the Conservatives to attack Attlee on foreign policy or national security issues because he's part of the cabinet in this odd sort of situation. The British had done the same kind of thing in World War I. They had set up a kind of a unity cabinet, but that cabinet collapsed in 1916. It's one of the reasons why the Liberal Party went into decline. In this case, the Labour sticks together. The second thing is that Britain in World War II had, unlike the US, which has regular elections in 1940 and 1944 and 1942, British are a parliamentary system. They don't have necessarily fixed terms. And so Britain canceled scheduled elections. And so the previous election that had occurred in Great Britain was in 1935. So you had a parliament that had sat for 10 years. The country had changed in sort of dramatic ways. And so to a certain extent, Churchill's strength was sort of inflated. And the third thing is that Attlee offered a better message. His basic message was, Churchill was great in World War II, salute everything that he did, but the war is over. We need to focus on domestic issues in the aftermath of the war. I'll support Churchillian foreign policy efforts, so there won't be a significant change there. But unlike the Conservatives, we'll do something to address national health insurance. We'll do something to address social welfare, these sorts of things. And the Conservative response to this was largely Churchill won the war, but didn't really offer anything promising for the following 5 years. Polling is in its infancy at this point. There really aren't lots of polls on the election. So the general assumption is, sort of along the lines of the question, which is Churchill, was the savior of Western democracy, played a critical role in winning the war. Surely he's going to win. This didn't happen. Attlee's foreign policy is, his approach to the early stages of the Cold War is I think very, very similar to what Churchill would have pursued. So this really was an election that was almost exclusively about domestic affairs. One other thing here, Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms, of course, in the U.S., but even Roosevelt's strength had begun to decline in 1940, and Roosevelt in 1944 has the worst of his 4 performances in running for president. So there was some sense of fatigue, even in the U.S. with a party that had seemed to have been around forever. Second question, why was Switzerland and Sweden not occupied by Germany? And how did these 2 countries manage to stay out of the war, especially Switzerland? I noticed on the map, all countries surrounding Switzerland were either at war with Germany or occupied by German forces. This is a really good question. So here is the map of the military map of Europe as of 1942. So Germany at this point is extended into the Soviet Union. So here's Switzerland, as the question said, surrounded by this point entirely by either Axis powers, Germany or Italy, or areas conquered by the Germans. And here's Sweden, which is in a slightly different strategic position. So next door to Norway, which has been occupied by the Germans, and to Finland, which is waging war against the Soviet Union, but doing so as for its own particular reasons. The Soviets and the Finns had been in a war in 1939. So, Finland is technically an ally of the Nazis at this point, but their position is different than any other country in the world. So the issue is how do these two countries remain neutral? Basically, they remain neutral because it's convenient for them and convenient for the Germans to keep them as neutral. Both countries, in important ways, tilt towards Germany, at least at this stage of the war. So for Sweden, Sweden has a significant production of iron ore. The Swedes are willing to, sort of continue trading with Germany despite Germany's, human rights abuses. And so, from the German standpoint, there isn't much of a benefit to come in occupying Sweden as long as the, Swedish, war materials are working their way to Germany. And in the case of Switzerland, the Swiss independence and neutrality is useful to the Germans for a couple of reasons. The first are questions of intelligence, spying. The Bern, the capital of Switzerland, is kind of a spying hotspot in World War II, sort of what Berlin will be during the Cold War. And so there are Nazi spies and Italian spies, Russian spies, American spies, British spies, and so there's a kind of usefulness from the strategic perspective for the Germans to have an area where they might be able to probe for Allied intentions. The second is that the Swiss banking system, which is notorious then and now for its obsession with privacy in all respects, is useful for the Germans. One of the many horrific stories of World War II is Nazi efforts to loot the possessions of the Jews and of other people that they kill. A lot of those, a lot of that money goes directly to just high-ranking officials of the Nazi party, who, for understandable reasons, want to hedge their bets and get some of those funds deposited in Swiss bank accounts, which is exactly what happens. And this has been a story of sort of international financial history over the last 76 years, in terms of will the Jews who were who were robbed, or the descendants of the Jews who were murdered, be able to get access to this? And the Swiss are resolutely opposed to this until quite recently. So basically, the answer to the question is it's sort of, Germany wouldn't have gained much by occupying them, because both Sweden and Switzerland accommodate the Germans in as much as they can. And this is actually the same thing that occurs with Spain, and to a slightly lesser extent with Turkey in the early stages of the war. Ireland is an exception. Ireland, was quite strongly anti-British. The British had colonized Ireland for hundreds of years. So Ireland is not. They just don't participate in the war. It's not as if they're particularly pro-German. And Portugal is a little like Switzerland, although more on the neutral side. It's convenient for both the British and the Germans to have Portugal as neutral. Several questions relating to events in East Asia. Why were Japan's war crime trials less aggressive and less talked about, even though what they did was just as bad as Nazi Germany? And then a couple questions relating to the atomic bomb. Did Japan surrender primarily because of the bombing, and did they perhaps realize that the U.S. didn't have any additional atomic bombs in possession at the time of Nagasaki? And then the other question is, did the U.S. warn Japan in any way that if they didn't surrender, a second nuclear bomb attack would occur? First was more than enough to subdue. What was the point of dropping the second? Let's start with the atomic bomb questions first. Japan did not know that the U.S. was out of atomic bombs, although this would have been a temporary thing, and the U.S. had other material in production, and so they would have gotten another bomb relatively quickly. They did and didn't surrender because of the bombing. The Japanese government wanted to end the war in the early summer of 1945. But rather than negotiate directly with the United States, they sent feelers out to all countries, the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were still neutral at this point. Soviets had no interest in the war ending before the Soviets were able to get in, because the Soviets wanted to conquer Manchuria, which they did. So those peace feelers really went nowhere. You know, it's entirely possible that the war in the Pacific could have ended without the use of the atomic bombs. The U.S. did not warn Japan about its dropping of the bombs, either the first or the second. And Truman gets a lot of, has gotten, well, not a lot, but some criticism, especially from kind of left-wing forces in the academy and in public life, about the dropping of the atomic bombs, and this was a moral failure and things like that. I think that, it's a hard argument to make for the dropping of the first bomb, given how awful World War II was in a variety of ways. Military concluded without the dropping of the bomb, the U.S. was going to have to invade Japan with massive casualties. The second bomb it's a lot harder. It seems to me to make a moral argument in its favor, or a strategic argument in its favor. The sense here is that Truman authorized the use of 2 atomic bombs, and rather than just do one, pause, see how the Japanese responded. And there is an irony here. The U.S. position is that they demand unconditional surrender by Japan, but even after the second atomic bomb, Japan imposes a condition on the surrender, and that condition is that the emperor Hirohito will remain in power, will not be tried as a war criminal, he will be stripped of all authority, so he becomes exclusively a constitutional monarch. Hirohito had some political powers before and during the war, but this is a condition demanded by the Japanese, and it's a condition that ultimately is accepted by the United States. I think the U.S. could have ended the war without the second atomic bomb. And this picture also gets to the first question: why were Japan's war crime trials less aggressive and less talked about, even though what they did was so terrible? There are a couple of things that differentiate the U.S. occupation, the occupation of Japan, from the occupation of Germany. The first is my slip of the tongue. It was a U.S. occupation of Japan. The United States was directing it. The Soviets did not participate in this. The British and French had essentially insignificant roles. So the U.S. is making the decision. And unlike in Germany, where if Hitler hadn't killed himself, Hitler would have been put on trial. There is this decision not to try the leader of the official leader of the country, because the sense among Americans is that if Hirohito remains in office and gives his blessing to the American occupation, which he does, that will create more stability in Japan. It will make it less likely that the Japanese military and population will resist the occupation. So there is this kind of political trade-off. There are war crime trials. Some of the actual leadership of the Japanese military and wartime polity is tried, convicted, and executed. But those trials very quickly trail off as the Cold War intensifies, and the U.S. makes the decision that we're worried that maybe Japan might float into the Soviet zone. We want to keep Japan in the U.S. zone, and we're comfortable with working with the economic system as it existed. So the Japanese war crime trials are phased out much more quickly than those in Germany, for reasons of post-war rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And final question: what was the reason behind the Soviets executing the 20,000 Polish officers, and why did they blame the Germans? They blamed the Germans because they didn't want to admit what they had done. The reason is from this map. So remember, in 1939, in one of the snippets, I talked about the Nazi-Soviet pact, where they agreed to divide up Eastern Europe, and so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, are given to the Soviet Union, and basically the eastern 1/3 of Poland and the portion of Romania. Soviet-Polish relations had been terrible since the creation of the Soviet Union and the recreation of Poland after World War I. There's a significant war between Poland and the Soviet Union. At one point, the Red Army in 1920 gets just up to the gates of Warsaw. They're driven back, and the Polish army then conquers this disputed territory, which has some Poles, but a lot of White Russians in modern day Belarus, and Ukrainians. So it's not as if Poland is just conquering Polish territory. So there's this sense among the Soviets that, look, this is a country that wronged us a generation ago. There's a sense among the Poles, an accurate sense, I think, that the Soviets are out to get them and they need to be very, very cautious. So in 1939, when the Soviets get this offer from the Germans of, all right, let's do a deal here, the Soviets are all too happy to oblige, and they also are thinking ahead to the post-war situation. And what they want to do is basically eliminate the Polish military and political leadership to ensure that if they do emerge triumphant from World War II, and they choose not to annex Poland, and ultimately they'll annex most of this tannish territory here, but the rest of Poland will remain independent. So if Poland's going to be independent, they want to ensure that it's a pliant, quote unquote, friendly leadership in Poland, and this more anti-communist leadership will be eliminated. The Soviet killing. There was another question asked by good question asked by someone by Anna that suggested, all right, look at Stalin's war crimes. Did that have an effect? And largely it did not. And I think because it didn't, Stalin thought that he could get away with the killing of the Poles. This is a major diplomatic and political controversy. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, both Churchill and Roosevelt back Stalin over the Polish government in exile, because they need the Red Army to continue fighting Hitler. This is an issue, the massacre, which remains. Poland is a difficult state for the Soviets to establish a satellite over during World War II. To a certain extent, it remains an issue in Russian-Polish relations today. The party that controls Poland is a strongly anti-Russian party, strongly nationalist. The Russians have never really acknowledged what they did in this massacre. It's one of a lot of these sort of killings of what would clearly be war crimes by today's standard that occur in East Central Europe. There are similar massacres in Czechoslovakia, after the war in Romania and Hungary. In the Baltic states, the Soviets deport tens of thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians to Siberia, and steal their houses and import in Russians to these formerly independent countries, to create a class of people in the Baltic states who will be loyal to Moscow and will do Moscow's biddings after World War II. So there's a book on this part of the world in World War II called The Bloodlands, and that's to a certain extent what it is. It's just massive amounts of killing. All right, so excellent questions. Hope all is well, and I will talk to everyone soon.